in Beyond Buildings, promoting cultural landscapes. So we're just going to get started. Want to introduce myself. My name's Amy Mino. I run an organization called Minnesota Landmarks, and we manage Landmark Center in St. Paul. I've gotten involved in quite a few historic preservation projects over the years, and Charlene snagged me for this one as well. But this was just a really great project, and enjoyed working on it, and we're really going to enjoy presenting it to you today too. So to introduce our panel here, Rachel Peterson, here in the first spot, has been with Hess Roise, historical consultant since 2014, worked on a lot of cultural landscape projects. And today she is going to be presenting two local landscapes and the concepts that we'll be talking about in practice. And then this lady probably needs no introduction, Charlene Roise. Has extensive experience, of course, with cultural resources, the co-founder of Hess Roise. And she also serves on the National Trust Board of Advisors and has been on the board of the Cultural Landscape Foundation. And we'll be talking a little bit more about what that is a little bit later. Charlene will be introducing the concepts behind and the framework around cultural landscapes. And then Michael Jischke, on our end here, is with SRF, and he's the past president of the Minnesota chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects, ASLA, and the organizing agency for What's Out There Weekend Twin Cities, which was presented in 2021. So Michael will be talking a little bit more about that and the outcomes from that. So why are we here? We're going to be talking about, what are the types of historic landscapes? What framework do you need to use to evaluate those? And how do they fit into the concept of work that you're doing in your communities? And we're going to have a call to action at the end to get you all involved in getting your cultural landscapes on what's called the What's Out There database. And again, we'll be looking at a couple of local case studies. Rachel will be talking about Sibley Park and Land of Memories Park right down here in Mankato. And then talking to you about creative ways that you can promote awareness of historic landscapes as part of your work and share this national database, which is just a wonderful tool. The Cultural Landscape Foundation, tclf.org, that's up on the screen. They have 4 key programs that they do. The Pioneers of American Landscape Design, which is a multimedia library. They have video oral histories chronicling the lives of important, significant landscape architects and educators. They also have an endangered list, which is called Landslide. And we actually have a example of one of those on the presentation today. They do an architectural prize called the Cornelia Hahn Oberlander International Landscape Architecture Prize. And then, of course, the What's Out There Weekend online database, which we'll be talking about a little bit more. They have a really wonderful website. It's great for browsing. So we encourage you to go and take a look at that. They do have an event coming up in Minnesota. It's at PV Plaza, a reception October 27th. Everyone is invited to that, but it is a fundraiser, so there is a little bit of a hefty price tag on it, but it's a great way to meet Charles Birnbaum, the director of TCLF, and talk about cultural landscapes. So what's out there? I mean, we'll be going on the database a little bit later and showing you how it works. But it is a list of North America's largest online database of cultural landscapes. So you can look up anything if it's there. And most of the sites that are on there have been done by volunteers. So people like you can submit for that. And we will be talking about how you can do that a little bit later in the presentation. And now I'll call up Charlene to talk about how do we do this.
Thanks, Amy. So when you think about cultural landscapes, it's kind of a big topic. And the first question is, so as a preservationist, how are you going to be evaluating these things? And I always go back to the National Register of Historic Places and the guidance that's provided there. So for cultural landscapes, you're looking at the same kind of things as you do for buildings. And we're all probably a little bit more used to thinking about buildings in terms of National Register status. But you're still thinking about the 4 criteria, A, B, C, and D, and about the period of significance, there's the 50-year rule, so things typically have to be at least 50 years old to qualify, but not always. And then, of course, integrity. A lot of times, cultural landscapes are districts, and basically they're, this is the National Park Service's definition up here. Basically, it's a collection of both natural and human-made features that are important for their relationship to something, an event, an activity, or a person, or some other significant cultural or aesthetic thing. And there are 4 types, generally: designed landscapes, vernacular, historic sites, and that's like Fort Snelling, or ethnographic landscapes. And I'll be talking mostly about the first 3. It's more anthropologists, archaeologists that get into the 4th one there. And so this is an example, some examples. The top 2 slides are of a historic district, Shaw Point National Register District on Sand Island in the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin. And there are 3 different areas representing 3 different periods of development on the island. There's farming and fishing originally, then there's early resort people, and then there's the more family resort or family compound people. And when you're doing a landscape like that, you're not just looking at buildings, and some of the buildings are things like outbuildings. So there were some very interesting outbuildings out there, I must say. But there are docks, there are trees, you're looking at lampposts, just everything in the landscape, as well as, of course, the lake and the effect of the lake on that landscape. The bottom left is from Prairie Moon Sculpture Park also in Wisconsin. And you could say it's a designed landscape. A guy designed it, but it's pretty wacky. He was a farmer who decided to start casting things in concrete, and it's very whimsical and wonderful, but it's not exactly what you'd expect to see from coming out of a landscape architecture school. And then the bottom right example is a cemetery. And, you know, everybody's got cemeteries in their community, and there's a National Register. They're categorically excluded from the National Register, but there is a criteria consideration D that you have to make a case and you can get them on the register. So cemeteries have a lot of opportunities for being pretty interesting cultural landscapes. Now I'll show some examples. So criterion A, it's for a property that's associated with a significant event or activity. In this case, I have photos here of a farm outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. And it was a controversial Section 106 review. There was a farmstead, and everybody agreed that the farm buildings were eligible for the National Register. But the Nebraska SHPO said, we don't think that the fields that are associated with the farm buildings should be part of the National Register property. And we said, the pattern is there forever. They really should be. So we ended up dragging the poor keeper of the National Register, who was Carol Schull at the time, woman in the white shirt, out into a field. And she agreed with us. So be thinking big when you're looking at cultural landscapes. It's not just, you know, a little area sometimes. You really have to look at the context. We've got some amazing examples here. Of course, a lot of farms in Minnesota, so those are interesting to be thinking about. There's also big industrial sites like up on the Iron Range. This is the taconite storage yard in 2 harbors by the docks in Agate Bay. They're handsome in their own kind of way if you're into that kind of thing, which I am. But nobody can deny, even if you don't think they're gorgeous, nobody can deny that they're just massive. And you have to really be looking at these at a giant scale. And they really talk about the history of this region in a very important way. So that's an example of another criterion A. Criterion B is for a significant association with a significant person. And this example is of Theodore Worth. So Minneapolis wanted him to come out from the East Coast to be the park board superintendent in 1906. He wasn't so keen on the idea, but he said, okay, I'll come if you do a couple of things for me. One is give him a car. And a driver. He never learned how to drive, so he was always being driven around. But another one was he wanted to have a house built for him in a park. So the park board did that. He had established the first public rose garden out in Connecticut where he'd been. And so he said, I want to establish another public rose garden. So that's why we have the rose garden at Lake Harriet. So those landscapes are all significant for their association with worth. Criterion C is kind of the easier one sometimes. That's for more of the architectural, landscape architecture, design things. And the Grand Rounds in Minneapolis, which is this giant network of something like 50 miles of parks and parkways that's all interconnected except for one missing link. And that was determined to be all eligible for the National Register. That's huge. It's not listed, but it's eligible. And it was designed, most of it was designed over different eras. And it's pretty compelling landscape. And then there are some properties that you have to think about multiple categories. So some are eligible both for their historical significance and their aesthetic significance. And that was the case with PV Plaza, which is on Nicollet Mall in front of Orchestra Hall in Minneapolis. Now that one had a couple of challenges. One was that it was less than 50 years old. It opened in 1975, and we did this nomination a while back. So it was a stretch time-wise. Also, you always hear you can't get anything on the National Register if the designer is still alive. And Paul Friedberg was not only alive, he had like a little kid, and he was still working. He still has an office. However, we did manage to convince the National Park Service to put this property on the National Register because of its national significance. It's really, really an important property, and we managed to get it from being demolished. With parks or with any kind of landscape, one of the biggest problems is the integrity issue. Landscapes change. Trees come, trees go. Winter comes, stuff happens. So it's a really unique challenge for dealing with landscapes. We have all the same 7 criteria or 7 aspects of integrity as with other National Register things. But what happens when you add a bench, a park bench? Well, maybe not a whole lot. What about if you add a whole separate circulation system? So in Minneapolis in the Grand Rounds, they put in separate bike routes. They parallel the pedestrian routes generally, but it's more, more paths. What impact does that have? You need signage, obviously, but what happens when you start building bigger kiosks? And then what happens if you decide to put a modern picnic pavilion smack dab in the middle of a 1930s Federal Relief era park, as they did in Duluth, bottom left? There's a picnic pavilion in front of the beautiful Lincoln Park stone pavilion from the 1930s. And even worse, what happens when your landscapes start falling apart, or when the features like the stone wall that you see in the bottom right, that again is in Lincoln Park. And some of the other issues are ADA accessibility. This park was not very easy to get to if you couldn't use your legs. So there was a real concern. It's in a neighborhood where there's a lot of economic challenges. How do you make this park work better for today? Worked really well back in the early 1900s. How can it work better for today? I love this quote. It's from Betsy Barrows Rogers, who's a very prominent landscape architecture historian. But the whole concept is the absurdity of trying to congeal the creativity of the past in a form that is reverentially static. And then her last line is, next year being every gardener's favorite phrase. So when you think about it, that's true. Gardeners are always out there wanting to change things. And that's kind of runs against some of the things that preservation has taught us to think about. While we're in challenges, I've got to bring up period of significance. This is another one you might have to wrestle with if you're analyzing the National Register qualifications. The beach extravaganza pavilion thing that you see on the upper right was at Worth Park. It hasn't been there for a long time. Does it matter that it's not there? Or what I mentioned before, putting in a whole new circulation system. Maybe that becomes part of the period of significance. Maybe some of these newer layers. When we first looked at the Grand Rounds in the 1990s, the paths have been put in the 1970s. They were too new. They were considered non-contributing. Now they're considered contributing, or at least I think they're contributing. I think the ship occurs. So you have to kind of reevaluate things even once you think you know what you're talking about. So how do you do all this? Well, get off your butt, get out there, do your research and field work. Get into the field, dig into the archives, not just the internet, go to the archives, really do, get dusty. And the answers will become clear, or at least a little clearer, if you really understand the resource you're dealing with. For example, the bottom right corner, there were certainly not freeway barriers along Kenwood Parkway back in 1905 or whenever, but, and we probably wish they weren't there, but does it really matter in the giant context of the Grand Rounds? That's a big, big district that can take, it has a pretty big carrying capacity. For maybe a pocket park, if you put something right in it, that would be a different story. So you really have to look at the context of the property itself. So where do you get guidance for this stuff? Back with this whole, in the 1900s, back when the National Register got established, they had they developed the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic buildings. And Charles Birnbaum didn't like that. He was working for the Park Service, so he lobbied very hard to get it for the treatment of historic properties. And he also, in 1996, they came out with a guidance specifically for cultural landscapes. I have a copy of it up on the desk if anyone wants to look at it afterwards. So that is kind of the Bible for establishing, for just starting to look at cultural landscapes. And it lays out several different features that you want to look at. It's kind of organizing principles for looking at landscapes. And the first one is spatial organization and land use patterns. So get the big picture. And I'm using some images from a documentation study we did of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers in Milwaukee. That program was established by Lincoln before he got shot. This facility was actually started in 1867 in Milwaukee. And one of the things we did, and this was for Hal's study. So maybe you folks are familiar with HABS-HARE, the Historic American Building Survey and the Historic American Engineering Record. Now there's HAL's Historic American Landscape Survey too. All of these are archived in the Library of Congress. So we did this study for that. Oh, I was just going to mention Gene Garbarini and Damon Farber did these amazing maps and compulsively documenting every feature in this giant campus. You want to learn topography. Topography is the second major category. And a lot of times you want to just go back and figure out, how did this land get formed? What did the glaciers do? What did the rivers do? What did people do? So you want to find all these different layers of how the land itself evolved. Vegetation. For the Milwaukee project, Gene categorized every single tree. So that's the thing on the right, is the list of every tree. You don't always need to go to quite that extreme for when you're analyzing a landscape, but again, it depends on the landscape. Listen to the landscape. Circulation patterns are another category. The thing on the left shows different periods of circulation patterns through this complex. And how did we do research? Well, we looked at maps, we looked at postcards, we looked at aerials, everything we could possibly find. Water features. This is from a Minneapolis example from Lake of the Isles. I love this because it has two types of water features. Man-made, the fountain, which was originally for horses, but now it's not. And then Lake of the Isles in the background. So be looking for a whole array of water features. And last but kind of not least is structures, buildings, and objects. So normally as a preservationist, we are kind of trained to think of this first, but in the landscape guidelines, this comes last. So just keep that in mind, but they're also very important. And so you got to understand those. So once you kind of get an analysis of the resource, then you can understand and think about how you're going to manage it. And for that, I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Peterson with Hess, Roise & Company. I'm going to talk to you about two local examples and how we can apply this framework that Charlene has been talking about to two parks here in town. We'll start with Sibley Park here. We're looking at the Ott cabin on the west side of the park in peak colors last fall. But this was a really interesting study. This park, this landscape at Sibley Park has a very long history. It has been used as a park for a very long period of time. And so the research and the field work were really critical in this evaluation to understanding how this landscape has looked over time and how it's been used over time. And to locate some of you folks who might not be local, Sibley Park is at the confluence of the Minnesota and the Blue Earth rivers. It's a little hard to see, but it's the southeast park there at the confluence. And like many river confluences in Minnesota, this general area was used pre the formation of Mankato by the Sisseton and Wahpeton Dakota as a general meeting place, but because it has a long history of flooding, there wasn't a lot of permanent development here before Mankato became a town. And that use, after Mankato became a town, it started to have a specific recreational use at this site. In the 1870s, the Mankato Fair was held on the flat area south of what's called Sibley Mound. And in this early period, the park was mostly used as a racing track. That was the dominant feature on the landscape here, was this racing track for horse races and also bicycle races. And then, like I mentioned, there was a fairground nearby that was used frequently as well. And in 1887, the city of Mankato purchased 2 pieces of property to make this a city park. And by the end of the 19th century, the city began redeveloping that property into more of a picturesque landscape, what we think of today as kind of a typical park. And that work included removing the racetrack. So this top right image is the same area as where the racetrack was. So as a very different character as they're doing that work. And all of that work to create this park landscape included installing a lot of new trees and very lovely flower gardens, flower beds, installing new roads and walking paths. And that was all in service of trying to support this passive recreation. That was what people wanted to do in parks at the time. It was kind of a place to walk around and to have your picnic and kind of lounge for a lovely day out. And this was the period when Sibley Park really became a major community gathering space in Mankato. It was used by a lot of private organizations like church groups or other, like the Elks and the Moose and the other animal lodges, because it was the largest park in Mankato. A lot of the other parks in town are, 1 block neighborhood parks. You couldn't have a picnic with 100 to 200 people there. And the city recognized the power of this space and actually lobbied really hard for the Woodmen's Association to come hold their annual picnic in Sibley Park. It had been in Albert Lea. They saw the potential that we could bring a couple thousand people to Mankato and get those potential customers. And we have this lovely, very large site for them to hold their event. And then in 1907, the city built a zoo. This lovely picture of the peacocks, but that became one of the main attractions at Sibley Park and grew over time and had lots of different animals and became one of the main draws for both city folk and general people from the area or from farther afield to come to this park. One of the challenges with understanding this landscape is how much it grew over time. So on the left, you can see kind of the size Sibley Park started, which is relatively small. And then as the city purchased more property, purchased Sibley Mound, and then eventually purchased the land to the north, the park grew substantially and now reaches from the railroad corridor all the way to the river. And as Charlene mentioned, the changes inherent to landscapes over time and natural disasters are one of the big drivers of that change. Sibley Park has flooded many times, but the 1965 flood was one of the most impactful on the landscape and really damaged a lot of the features that were existing at that time. A lot of roads washed out. The petting zoo flooded and was destroyed pretty dramatically and tragically. And so in the recovery effort after that flood, there was a lot of discussion on what changes do we need to make to this landscape to minimize future damage. And so a lot of roads were reconstructed a little bit further inland, further uphill with some larger retaining walls. There was a lot of discussion about the petting zoo, and eventually they put in a smaller exhibit after this flood, but it was a thing that was very important for the city to have rebuilt, I think, kind of for people's emotional connection to this place. And also during this time, what people wanted to do in parks was changing. After World War II, there was a lot more interest in active recreation. And so in the later decades of the 20th century, you see more softball fields and those kinds of more active athletic amenities at Sibley Park that reflects those changing recreational patterns. So as Charlene mentioned, getting out there and figuring out what's there now is really important. And one of the interesting things in this evaluation is that most of the structures that are existing in Sibley Park today are pretty recent. The band shell that's there now was built in 1993. The petting zoo is from 2007. A lot of the retaining walls and picnic shelters, and there's a gazebo now on the top of Sibley Mound. Those are all 1980s forward. And so how does that play into our evaluation of integrity? Was a big question for me when I was doing this study. But when you zoom out, you can see that there are a lot of really major landscape features in this park that are still there. And to me, what was very important was understanding the spatial organization of this park, the topography, and the vegetation. Over time, the topographical feature of Sibley Mound in the middle of this park has really dictated how different zones were used. And south of the park, after the racetrack era, was really the passive recreation zone. That's where you were looking at pretty flower beds, you were lounging about in the field, you were going to see the prairie dogs at the petting zoo. And on the north side of Sibley Mound was that much more active recreation zone. And that spatial organization is still intact. And that's, like I mentioned, defined a lot by the topography and also defined by the vegetation. Sibley Mound has, over many hundreds of years, always had very dense vegetation. It's been very open on the north side and had very more groomed and intentional plantings on the south side. So taking that all into account, we felt that this site still had really good historic integrity as a cultural landscape. Here are a couple more views of those features. So moving across the river to the west, we'll talk about Land of Memories Park for a little while here. We're looking at the Wachipi or Powwow Arbor and Arena in this photo here. And this park is at the same confluence of the river, but has a very different history. And this was a good example of how our research in properties shouldn't just focus on what it was at the beginning, that you really need to understand later uses and later evolutions, because this landscape really didn't gain its significance until the 1970s. And, like Sibley Park, its neighbor, this site had a lot of flooding issues. It was originally platted for residential development, but people smartly figured out that that was probably a poor idea. And it was never actually constructed. And so the landscape itself was really stagnant for a long period of time. And you can see from these aerial photos that between 1938 and 1964, it looks pretty much the same. There's not a lot of change or development going on here. In the 1960s and 70s, the city of Mankato started purchasing land here, and they used it as water well fields. So it became a municipal site or municipal property at that time, but it wasn't a park. It was just this place that the city owned. But in 1971, the Mankato Mdewakanton Association held the first Wachipi in Mankato, which was a really important event to invite Dakota people back to this area after they had been exiled following the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. And that first powwow, first Wachipi, was held up at Franklin Rogers Park, up where the Moondogs play. It lost a lot of money, and so the city was pretty uninterested in supporting it again. But these three men, Amos Owen in the center, Bud Lawrence to the left, and Jim Buckley to the right, felt really strongly that Mankato needed to have a Wachipi. And so it moved to Sibley Park for 1 year in 1974, had a little bit more interest and a little bit more support, which gave them some leverage to talk to the city and say, hey, we need a site for this. We need a spot that is going to be for this Wachipi every year. And so Land of Memories Park was designated as a city park to support that Wachipi use. And the landscape really reflects what that event needs. And that plays into its significance and integrity evaluation. So you can see here this is a view on the west side of Land of Memories Park where there are now soccer fields. This was a really interesting piece that came up in our research. In the early 90s, the city of Mankato, they have this lovely park. It's got this Wachipi arena. It's got a campground that supports the annual Wachipi, but that's being used for that use one weekend a year. What else can we have on this site? And so they decided, well, let's see if we can put some soccer fields here. And they talked to the Mid-Waukegan Association, and they had some real concerns about what that would mean for this landscape. And eventually the resolution that they came to was that these soccer fields were okay if they had no permanent parking and no permanent buildings, because the open character of this landscape was so important to support the annual Wachipi that needed to be preserved among or above any active soccer field use. So again, looking at this landscape, what has changed? What has stayed the same? As I mentioned many times, the parks at this confluence flood a lot, and the campground that is now at the north end of the park was originally at the southeast corner, but that was a really problematic location, so it was relocated. What does a move like that do? This site has always had a campground. It's really important to supporting the annual powwow. Is that okay? Does that shake out in the wash of a multi-100-acre park? Especially when really key features such as the topography and the open vegetation and that sacred Wachipi arena are intact and have a high degree of integrity. So in my opinion, in my recommendation, this park still has good historic integrity as a cultural landscape. Couple more views there of the Wachipi arena with the new arbor at the top. That was another item to discuss and address in the integrity evaluation. That's a really new structure, but it is really important again to the Wachipi use and really defines that sacred arena. And then the current campground on the bottom. And with that, I will hand it over to Michael, who can talk about what you can do to advocate for these historic resources in your community.
Good morning, everybody. Michael Jischke with SRF Consulting, and I'm really happy to be here as a landscape architect, but also as a person who likes to get out of the office and explore places. So it's great to venture down from the Twin Cities today. So my part of this is really to, I think, change the focus a little bit, as Rachel noted, and talk about how cultural landscapes can be promoted and shared with others. This goes back a couple years. In 2019, I was serving as chapter president of ASLA Minnesota, and had happened to work on a project recently with my firm with Charlene. So through some conversation, she asked if ASLA in Minnesota wanted to get involved in the What's Out There weekend planning. And frankly, it seemed like a slam dunk to me. I didn't feel the need to consult with the board. I just said right away, let's do it. Let's figure out a way. Because frankly, I knew that this is something that would resonate with our membership. And it also aligned with our mission, which in short, it's listed on the slide there, is advocating for landscape architecture through advocacy, communication, education, and fellowship. One other aspect that I considered, and I was reminded of a publication called Valued Places. You're seeing an image of that on the slide here. I don't know how many of you would have this on your bookshelf. I don't know how widely it was circulated, but Valued Places was developed by the chapter in 2001. As a grad student in the late 90s, this became a resource for me as I was getting to know the Twin Cities and Minnesota in general, and its significant landscapes. It was produced right after the centennial of ASLA, which was in 1999. And this became a great resource. If anybody is interested to get a copy, I know that we have some in the archives back somewhere, so feel free to come up and leave me your contact information afterwards. I want to share one quote from that by the editor of that publication, Frank Martin. He said, describing its purposes, "This is a field guide for Minnesota's greatest landscape architecture, only some of which was actually designed by landscape architects." And I think that's where we enter the conversation too, is that as a profession, we have this appreciation for not only the work we're doing, but also the context that it happens within. Please. The What's Out There weekend event, as Amy began describing it at the beginning of the presentation, was held in 2021, just about this time of the year, late September. And it was not an easy time to plan large group gatherings. We actually kind of midstream in between the 2019, as I noted when we started, and the actual event, we hit pause a little bit and kind of felt out how things like this could actually happen. The good news is that it was mostly outside, right? And I think we all discovered that during the pandemic that there's a value in public spaces different than maybe we had known before, whether it be for health or community building or the opportunities to connect with neighbors. Over the course of a little over a year, we planned this event together. It included 17 tours overall and 40 different sites. This was primarily in Minneapolis and St. Paul. It was a collaborative effort between a local group and the Cultural Landscape Foundation. But frankly, since Charles is not here today, Charles Birnbaum, I think we can take credit for the heavy lifting that we did locally to make it happen. In the course of that planning process, we engaged over 60 different professionals, including landscape architects, preservationists, community members, and other nonprofit organizations to either plan the event, do research, or lead tours. So I think we were successful in achieving that goal of increasing fellowship and advocacy by bringing these different groups together. And lastly, we had over 600 attendees at those 17 tours. So I think roughly 30 plus people each one. In the post-event survey results, we learned that most people only attended 1 to 2 tours. So I think we were successful in really reaching a lot of people. This type of event was targeted at both not only professionals, but also local residents, community members, and people actually travel from other parts of the country to see metropolitan areas and the best of the best landscapes that are there to experience. Next, please. So we started out with a handful of key goals when we were planning the event. The first is really the importance of direct field experience to really appreciate the landscapes within their context, and also firsthand interpretation. So we made great efforts after we got through kind of honing in on a set of sites to really make the designers, the preservationists that had researched and written about them, or community members that were actively involved in stewarding those landscapes, participate in those tours, so that they could share their insights directly with tour attendees. I think also there was really a goal to revisit some of the well-known historic landscapes in Twin Cities. There was no litmus test that these landscapes needed to be on the National Register. Certainly many of them are, but certainly in the 20 years between valued places and this effort, a lot had changed. Many of the even the significant design landscapes like something like Nicollet Mall had undergone a complete overhaul. So there was the goal to really revisit those and look at them and how they had changed. And then, frankly, the landscape architecture community also felt that there should be a goal of weaving in more contemporary and vernacular landscapes as well. We learned in that interim period that the landscapes that we inhabit every day are sometimes just as vital, not always designed by landscape architects, but we learned about the value of community engagement in the design of those landscapes. And so we kind of looked outside the kind of standard kind of frame of landscapes and identified a number of others. Part of the way that we did that is that we clustered them together. We had a hard time narrowing down the list. So we decided to cluster sites together more as connected sites in context rather than individual sites. Next, please. Here's a quick overview. I'm sure you probably can't squint to read the list of sites that are there. We do have some of the guidebooks up in front here that you're welcome to come browse. And I think we have a good amount that are you'd be welcome to take one home with you as well. They're really a beautiful product that kind of came of the outcome. There was really a goal to make it a high quality publication and do things the right way. And so as you can see, the distribution sites, primarily Minneapolis and St. Paul. We revisit many of the riverfronts and downtown sites, but also some more unique community sites that you'll see in a couple of the photos here as we go forward. Next, please. This particular photograph is Rondo Commemorative Plaza. So this is in the Rondo neighborhood, just south of I-94 in St. Paul, right in between Minneapolis and St. Paul. They're downtowns. And this was really a neighborhood-led effort to develop this space, really to commemorate the history of the neighborhood and the change that the construction of the freeway in the 1960s had on the people and the landscape that was there. So this was one of those more recent sites that we identified and incorporated in the tours. We also combined this with some other you'll see in the future. So when we looked at the range of sites, we did kind of begin to have some typologies that they fell within: campuses, urban plazas and greenways, urban regional parks, the Twin Cities. Although it's a denser urban area, we're fortunate to have these really sizable regional parks close at hand, like Theodore Wirth, or even the Central Riverfront in Minneapolis, which is a national park. So our tour leaders really kind of were empowered to really design these tours and think about unique ways that people could experience them. So all of them either involve walking or biking. It enabled people to, I think, begin to see the connectivity or sometimes lack of connectivity between some of these spaces within their surroundings, and really made for a more rich experience. So we did have some challenges, no doubt. So in the interest of some practical takeaways for you, if you're considering doing this in the future for other sites or locations, I would suggest starting early with the site selection process. This was the one that really required a lot of conversation, and we really went through a number of times screening the sites, talking about what merited some interpretation, inclusion or not, and I think it became a really rich selection overall. COVID probably doesn't really need much more explanation than that. Fundraising was a really big hurdle. As I said, we really set out to do a high quality event. So when you were thinking not only about the tours, everybody who helped with the planning and the tours was doing on a volunteer basis. But we also were considering this publication and supporting the development of the database as well by local people as well as TCLF staff. And then lastly, corralling those tour leaders, those the people with the deepest knowledge. As you can imagine, just a challenge logistically. So getting them to commit early was really important, and having ongoing conversations just to make sure things were coming together. So some of the keys to success that we found were really we had that wealth of landscapes to work with, and we had a core group of passionate people that stuck together. I met on Zoom weekly for a year or so, just to keep the ball rolling. And so we really tapped into that deep knowledge base. And I think the local national partnership was really an important aspect too. We really benefited from the experience of planning an event like this, the logistics from the Cultural Landscape Foundation, as well as their knowledge of other sites. But I think there was a reverse process as well, where we taught them about what was important in the Twin Cities and kind of opened their eyes to some of the cultural shifts and current events that were happening that really called into question a number of the spaces, such as the George Floyd Memorial or Hiawatha Golf Course, places like that that were at the top of people's minds. So in conclusion, thanks for this opportunity to speak with you. I'd love to answer any questions about organizing an event like this at the conclusion. And you know, as somebody representing the landscape architecture profession, we really value the legacy that we are carrying forward in the Twin Cities and Minnesota here, and look forward to our future work. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that came out of the What's Out There weekend effort that we still have with us. So in order to be able to do these beautiful guidebooks, which I encourage you to come up and take one, we have a stack of them. I don't know if I have enough for everybody, but we'll go through them. And they are actually also available in electronic download from the TCLF website, or you can order a copy from them. I think it's $10 or so, something like that, right from their site. But we have quite a few, so feel free to come up and grab one of those. We also, as part of this, did a more extensive. There were only so many sites that we could do as part of What's Out There weekend, just because of time and you know, how where you would end up going, you know, how you fit these tours together. But there were a lot more sites that we wanted to get on the TCLF database, because before this, I think there was just a handful of Minnesota sites on the database. And so we were sadly lacking in resources there. So we continued to work on it, and we had received a grant from the state's Arts and Cultural Legacy Fund to do the research and photography, because the high quality photographs are really important, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later. But we hired Barb Bazat as our researcher, and we kept working on these and ended up with 69 sites added to the What's Out There database in the end. And then, of course, the final products of the guide for the What's Out There weekend, and then the more extensive cultural landscape guide for sites in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And we have a few copies that you can look at here. Oops, someone wants to touch the mouse there. It'll come back eventually. So those were added to they're in the database, so you can look them up electronically, and we're going to show you how to do that at the end. But then also this MHS really wanted something in hard copy form, and so that's what that is. So the cultural landscape guide, and in order to get it on the TCLF database, they have some very specific things they're looking for. Charlene can talk about those a little bit more, but really short descriptions, 250 words are not very many words. And you really do need a good editor. Barb and I relied on Charlene, who did a great job with those. But a couple of different eyes on them really is helpful. Again, I mentioned high quality photos. Good photos are a must. We had written into our grant for some funding to pay for the photography that was important for the What's Out There weekend as well. And so that was really helpful. And I think, as you're thinking about maybe doing this in your communities, there may be a possibility too for some legacy funding to help you do some of this, and maybe even partnering among different historical societies and preservation organizations within, your geographic region might be a really great way to do that. So the site variety in the guide, as Charlene kind of talked about this earlier, they're not always places that you maybe would think. Golf courses, we had quite a few golf courses in there. This is the Town and Country Club in the top left photo. Cemeteries, which Charlene had mentioned earlier, that's Fort Snelling National. Skate parks, Jischke Skate Park in Minneapolis was one that was on the What's Out There weekend tours, and that is on the database too, a relatively new landscape in the Twin Cities. And then, of course, your more traditional ones too. The last one there is Irvine Park in St. Paul. Photography challenges, I think I'll pass that on to Charlene to talk a little bit about.
As Amy mentioned, we did have a professional photographer. He's actually someone who Charles Birnbaum has worked with. He came out from Washington or New York, I guess. And he had a drone, which was great because some of the places, it really helps to get the big picture, the drone picture. We discovered you cannot fly the drone over national parks. So when it got to the riverfront in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the drone just couldn't get through. So we learned a lot of stuff along the way. But we also, he only was available for a limited amount of time. That's all we could afford. So, and so we ended up doing a lot of photography ourselves as well. And I have to say that photographing a landscape is a lot harder than photographing a building. So these are just some examples of what I was trying to do at St. Anthony Park in St. Paul. The one on the top left, it's like, I mean, it's an important part of the landscape, but it's really hard. The relationship of that and the buildings is really important. And I just couldn't really get that over at Luther Seminary. On the right, if you put plants in the foreground, which makes the photograph more interesting, you kind of lose the big picture of the landscape. Bottom left, I think that's where I tried to put a planter in front, and that I didn't think that was very successful either. And the bottom right, and it's really hard to see, but I was super excited when I was out at one of the park spaces and there was a guy on a bicycle with his kid. And they're just a teeny little thing in the middle of the photograph. But to me, that was like, it made my day to actually have something that was like a focal point so I could focus on that. So just be patient. The really cool news, when I started in this profession, we were dealing with film and all of that rigmarole. But now with digital, it's like, just go for it, baby, and just take a lot of photos and also be prepared to come back at different times of the day. Because the quality of light, like morning light is amazing. And if you can get morning light, that's really super. Sometimes sunny days are not good because they cause too many shadows. So you really have to kind of trigger that or tailor that to your landscape. Some of the writing, so Amy credited me with editing, but there was the master editor in Washington, D.C., and the bottom right-hand corner is an example of what we got back once after we thought we were done with something. So as Amy said, it's incredibly hard. Try to imagine describing Summit Avenue in 250 words. It's just really hard because you'd have to do the history and the physical description. And the cool thing though is that the way it's set up, there are parents and children. So if you have something like the grand rounds, you can do the grand rounds, but then you can do specific parts as children, and they interrelate. They're interconnected in the database. So that's a saving grace. The Cultural Landscape Foundation website does have their list of style types, so you can go to that. And it's also really helpful if you're doing research and you just want to understand a certain type, there are different eras of golf courses. Who knew? So you have to, you can figure out which era of golf course your golf course happened to have fallen into in terms of design and philosophy. The top right is a style guide. That's for pioneers, which the Cultural Landscape Foundation has published a series of books on landscape architects, because Charles's theory is, unless it's in print, and even the digital age, unless it's in print, it doesn't exist. So to try to beef up the history of landscape architecture, he's been very good about getting things in print. And that's why the quality of the guidebooks is so important. And there are guidebooks from all over the country now that are in the same format. So anyway, so it's kind of a frustrating process sometimes getting stuff into the database, but it's worth the effort because it's super exciting now. And I think Amy's going to show some examples of that next. Oops. Crazy. You were both hitting it at the same time. There you go.
Everyone hear me? We're going to go on to the database here. So this is the TCLF's website. And you can see there are different, the programs that I talked about earlier along the top. The database is in places. Oops. Great, thanks. So you can get into the database and then search it. So what's out there? And again, this is national, so you can look up things across the country, especially significant landmarks, and be able to find them and find out about their history, why are they important, and see what they look like. So we're going to go in and we're going to look for the Minnesota State Capitol. And you can see there were several things that came up, including what's out there weekend Twin Cities here. But you can click on the state capitol. You can find out what category it is. It's a designed landscape. What type is it? Institutional grounds, governmental institution or facility. What style is it? Beaux Arts and neoclassical is where that fit in. And then who designed it. And these are all separate links that you can learn about the landscape architects who were involved in this. And then the write-up, again, the 250 words. This one seems longer, but maybe we snuck in something there, yeah. And then you can go in and they have a media gallery where you can flip through photos of the site. And again, you can see how really nice these photos are. Let's see. And how do I get out of this? There we go. And then also where it's at. So it's really a great resource right there at your fingertips. And again, I encourage everyone to get on and take a look at that. We need outstate landscapes in the database. So we want to see, let's see, I'm going to go back to our slide presentation here. Yes.
Just while she's doing that, if you look up the TCLF website on your phone and you're in, say, Baltimore, you can actually search, you can get to a map, the map that Amy showed you, but if you search that, you can actually find landscapes that are within, say, 5 miles of where you are. So if you want to set up your own little walking tour when you go someplace, you can do that on the fly or in advance if you're more organized than I am. But it's a really cool to be able to go into a place you don't know and find out about some cool landscapes that you never would have found out about otherwise.
Okay, I accidentally turned our presentation off, so give me just a second here. There we go. Actually, let's do this.
While she's doing that, a couple of other thoughts. One thing, I don't know if anybody mentioned this, but the tours for the What's Out There weekend were absolutely free. So that's one reason why fundraising was so important and why we put in so many volunteer hours. TCLF is an amazing organization. It's not a membership organization. It's supported strictly by however many funds they can raise. So I would encourage all of you to donate, especially if you find the resources helpful, because it's an amazing organization. I was on the board for almost 20 years, and I don't stay on the boards of anything that long if I don't really believe that they're doing really amazing work with a very small dedicated staff in Washington.
So again, the Twin Cities are very well represented now on the database. These photos here, of course, you can recognize. Those are icons from the Twin Cities. The Walker Sculpture Garden, Rice Park and Landmark Center, and Como Park. But we really want to see all of Minnesota represented here. We have great opportunities here. So that's our marching orders. And we're definitely here as a resource if you're thinking about doing it. We know some of those challenges, having gone through it, and you should think about doing it too. And now we'll go on to questions. Are there any questions from the audience for us? We have one over here. So, what's the impact of the property on doing this? Is the Yep. Who wants to take it? Charlene, you want to take that?
So yeah, so the question about the impact of being on the database, there's zero impact really. I mean, it's educational, so maybe, I mean, with something like, when you're trying to save a property, it could be very helpful. And the landslide program is kind of an expansion of one of the database items. And so if you have a landscape that's endangered, you can talk to the Cultural Landscape Foundation about trying to get that to become a landslide. And then they help publicize it. They don't have any money they can give you, but they can help, direct you to how to fight. They really helped with saving PV Plaza, for example. Actually, we were co-litigants on that, and that was a long, difficult battle, but we won. So they're very wise about those kinds of things. National Register is a whole different thing. And one other thing I failed to say is that a whole lot of properties aren't going to qualify for the National Register, right? I mean, the reason it's a cool thing is because it's important. It's hard to get on the National Register, but there are a lot of important landscapes that don't merit National Register designation, but they're still really important. So.
Well, and I would just encourage you to think about your sites in the context of where they sit. So like, for example, Gibbs Farm, which is in Ramsey County, it's definitely not just about the farm building, a barn or the house. It's about the site itself. So the landscape around it is really important. And I see Ben Vanderkoy from Laverne, he's in the back. They're struggling with a site in Laverne, the Fred Manfred House, which was built into the side of a hill. And when Fred Manfred built it, it wasn't part of the state park, but the DNR bought it later. But the house is important, but also the context of where it is too. So again, just think about you may have an historic site that you're trying to save, but then the context around it is important too. Other questions? Yes. Well, definitely the National Register does add an extra layer of protection. You're up against competing interests there. So, I mean, and I know with the Manfred House, that's the case there with the DNR. But it does add a level of protection. We're going to pass it down to Rachel.
Right, echoing what Amy said, even being eligible for the National Register, but also being listed gets you part of the compliance review process for projects that are federally funded or state funded or need a permit in some way from one of those agencies. And so that does then give you a seat at the table to have discussions about what's going to happen to that cultural resource. So it provides that level of compliance review that can be really useful in guiding a project. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, anybody can submit anything on anything. However, they're very thoroughly vetted. And if you own a property and you're not happy with the way it's being presented on the database, first of all, that usually doesn't happen. But you just talk to them and explain. And if you have justification for making changes, they make, I mean, it's just an online thing. They can make changes relatively easily. So. And likewise, if you have additional photos or something that you think really should be added, you know, you could maybe get those added if you have better photos. So it's a flexible thing. They are limited by their staff time. That's the only thing. Other questions? Yes.
Yes, it was, as I alluded to, it was a lot of work. No, it was not discussed like as an annual event. Trying to think about where TCLF went this year. Do you happen to recall, Charlene?
Cleveland was one.
Cleveland.
But they do repeat. So like San Francisco has had 3, I think, but in different areas featuring different things.
Yeah, so from TCLF's perspective, they do move around the country every year, pick a few different larger metropolitan areas. But I'm glad you asked the question though, because there actually is an opportunity in the Twin Cities to see many of these landscapes again. The ASLA is holding its national conference on landscape architecture here at the end of next month, October 27th to 30th. And so the What's Out There weekend was a bit of a testing ground for us to outline many of these sites. Some of them we're going to be revisiting as part of the conference. And then there are many new ones that have been added as well. And that effort was kind of curated and led by Joe Faber, who is the head of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Minnesota. So I would encourage people to look at that conference if you're interested. But Thais, you know, I think that's one thing that we hear from our membership and allied organizations is that there's a desire to get out there and see things. So I think we try to work that into our programming annually and getting out and maybe a more limited basis. Are there any other questions?
Thank you so much for coming. And again, come up and we're available for questions, following up on it. Grab one of the guides, take a look at the more extensive cultural landscape guide, and enjoy your day here in Mankato.